All right, imagine this. Tomorrow morning, you get the call that your CEO is out. Maybe they suffered a family bereavement. Maybe there's an illness. Maybe they've just decided to quit. Whatever the reason, most companies have no plan for this, and the fallout is often devastating. That's why every business, no matter what size, needs an emergency succession plan. And today, I'll break down what that is, why it matters, and how you can put one in place before it's too late. All right, so what is emergency succession planning? Emergency succession planning is any kind of succession plan that is preparing you for an unplanned, short-term, unexpected departure of your senior leader. This also can be for key staff that you have in your organization. As I mentioned earlier, this happens about 50% of the time. So you should expect that, or at least you should be prepared for, that you may run into a scenario where you have an untimely transition in leadership in your organization. If you're prepared for that and you've thought through it and everyone's talked about this openly, then it's usually never a desired experience, but it doesn't become this traumatic, difficult upheaval that it otherwise often becomes. And so it helps you build a significant amount of resiliency. For emergency planning, there's three different, and just to reiterate, there's there's many different reasons why somebody will leave. I think I've mentioned this before, but there's the potential for just dying happens more often than what it's sad, but it happens a lot. People get sick. Some in their family get sick. There's a major life or family crisis of some kind of disagreement that happens, some kind of a performance issue or any other issue, and the owners of the organization or the board decide this person isn't a fit anymore. Or, and this is always a surprise to people, or not always, but it frequently is people find greener pastures. They find that they've been working for an organization for a while, and there's something about another opportunity that's more appealing to them, and they take off and leave. And they don't always give you a reasonable amount of time to prepare for that departure. They often think they will. They'll give you maybe a little bit better than 2 weeks' notice. But as you can probably imagine, trying to replace your senior executive with just a few weeks of notice, sometimes even just a few months of notice, doesn't end up being enough time for it to be a smooth transition. And so these plans will help you think through that. There's three basic scenarios that happen that can create the sense of emergency. One is a short-term succession scenario. And so this is a situation where somebody is going to be gone for less than 3 months. Maybe they get into an auto accident. Maybe there's a family crisis, an older family member that needs care and they want to be with them. Whatever the situation is, there's something that takes them away for about 3 months period of time. You're going to fill the role temporarily, but the person is anticipated to come back. And so you're not making major changes to the organization, and you're not necessarily lifting major responsibilities away from that individual or giving too much responsibility to whoever fills in the interim. The other one is a long-term scenario. Incidentally, the short-term emergency scenario and the permanent one that I'll talk about next are the two most likely scenarios. Long-term departures happen, and they happen more often than you might think, but they don't happen that often. And that's any kind of departure that I would say is over 3 months, but you anticipate them coming back. And so this can be things like going to additional training. Somebody's pursuing their PhD in something, and they need to be gone for a little while for that, but you want them to come back, and so you make an arrangement. Maybe maybe it's cancer. Maybe they're gone for a while, and it's going to take them a year or 6 months of treatments to figure out if they can come back and how they're going to come back, or whatever the scenario is. They're gone for an extended period of time. A lot of times it can be burnout related, and you kind of get a lot of these short-term scenarios. There was an executive situation, an organization I'm familiar with, where the executive took a sabbatical for a few months, came back and immediately took an extended vacation, came back and immediately went into a rehab type scenario. And in that kind of a situation, they ended up being gone for at least a year, if not longer. And they weren't really sure how to prepare for it. That placed a tremendous burden on that organization because it was so hard to work with, and they were not prepared for any of it. The last one's permanent. They're just gone. Whatever the reason was, they're not coming back. And so the work that you do to build a short-term emergency succession plan is most of the work that you need for a long-term plan. There's a few minor changes in it, and then all of this leads you into what you need for a permanent plan. So as you work through this, they're not three completely different plans. There's just this plan with a few changes, with a few other changes for those two possible scenarios that you'll run into. And all of the details for this and templates for it can be found on my website, christianmuntean.com, under the Succession360 Toolkit. I have everything that you need to just walk through these plans. The contrast, though, with this is this key assumption that you don't necessarily have the next leader definitively teed up and ready to go. And that when that next, and even if you did, you've already, this assumption here is that you've planned through what happens if that person needs to leave a key role. Let's say you have your CFO is going to fill in for the CEO for a 3-month absence. How well are they going to be able to fill in or take care of their CFO roles? And how do you also backfill for that? So that's part of what these scenarios think about and take a look at. Here's why this matters. As I mentioned, 50% of executive departures are unanticipated and unplanned. And they happen with short or little or no notice. You just find out the person's gone. I've seen everything from literally somebody being hit by a truck and survived, is healthy and running the organization again. But I get a call one day saying so-and-so got hit by a truck and we have no idea what to do. And so I came in and helped them walk through the process and create a plan for how they were going to navigate from here to, we weren't sure when that person or even if that person would come back, and they eventually did. But the amount of stress and the amount of disruption that not being prepared for that caused was significant. When there isn't a plan in place, organizations tend to either fall into a decision paralysis scenario where they wait too long to make decisions and it creates other problems. It compounds the problem. Or they get very reactive. A classic situation or classic example of reactivity is doing panic hires. Like, hey, you're the next person on the organizational chart. Mr. CFO, Mr. COO, you're now the CEO. Congratulations. They may or may not want the job. They may or may not have any of the attributes that are necessary to be successful in that role. They may or may not be prepared for it. Maybe they're great at it, but there's no one to fill in for their important role. And so these kinds of panic hires can often create huge problems within the organization, even if you're bringing in good people. And so you want to have some kind of a thought through process or scenario planning for this. There are literally no advantages to not having put thought into what are we going to do if there's an emergency. There will never be a point where you think that was a waste of time. We shouldn't have thought about that. You're just not going to run into that experience. It will always be, if you think through the questions and the templates that I have in the Succession360 process, which is free, as you look through that, you'll always come to the conclusion of this helps us build a stronger, more ready, healthier, more confident organization. There's some benefits to this as well. For example, insurance and bonding agents like to see that there's a plan in place. This can actually help you with reduce costs in those areas. Lenders like to see this. Basically, anybody that has a vested interest in your risk wants to know that you've thought through how do we mitigate that risk. And so there's more benefits besides just having a solid, stable succession process. Some customers actually really want to see this. If you're working with a large customer that requires you to always 100% be ready to go, be ready to provide, to deliver the service or the product, and there cannot be glitches, there cannot be any kind of lateness in it because of their needs for their customers, they like to know that you've thought through contingencies. And this can help you if you're trying to get into larger markets to demonstrate that you're that level of a professional organization, that you can be trusted in that way. So here's some core elements of the emergency. Let me back up. So here's some core elements of the emergency succession plan, and they're part of all of the different scenarios. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I do go into it in the Succession360 Toolkit, but this gives you an idea of what you'll need to be thinking about. The first aspect of this is thinking about named or pre-naming, pre-defining acting successors. So not your pre-naming your permanent successors, but who's going to fill in that gap period. The second thing is thinking through what authorizations will they need in terms of being able to access the bank, being able to make financial decisions, any kind of contracting or binding decisions for the organization, hiring and firing type scenarios, any of those kinds of questions that can have a significant impact. What level of authorization do you want to give this possibly temporary interim acting successor? The third thing that you want to be able to think about is key roles and responsibilities. So partially this is what authority does that person have, but also as other people's roles might shift to accommodate the load on the acting successor, who not always, but often comes from inside the organization, at least for a short period of time. What are the key roles and how do you define that so people aren't spending months being confused about who do you go to for what? If this is already pre-thought through and predefined, even if you need to make adjustments in the reality of the situation, if you've already basically thought it through, you'll find the process to be much easier. The fourth thing that needs to be thought about is compensation. If you bring in an acting successor or you elevate somebody into that role, maybe they're now doing two jobs. They're being the CFO and the CEO. That's probably going to be a lot of work. And will there be some kind of compensation benefit to that? At some point, they're probably going to wonder about that. And so you should be thinking about that in advance so that you already have those decisions made, so that if a scenario happens, you're not wasting time negotiating things. You already know how this is going to work. You already know how this is going to play out. And I provide some recommended strategies for how to handle that in the Succession360 Toolkit. Another scenario, the fifth one, is a communication plan. So if there's a scenario where your executive is gone, a lot of people are going to need to know about this, and you want to make sure that the message that they're given is one that is appropriate and accurate for the organization, because you don't want this to become a gossip scenario. You don't want this to be a misinformation scenario. You want this to be, you want to have clear and accurate, and ideally current data going out there to your staff, to your customers, to your partners, to whoever needs to know. And you want to define who actually is responsible for the communication, because you don't want everybody on social media doing their own version of communicating what's going on. So having a communication plan in place, or at least a draft of a basic sense of key communication plan elements, will help you significantly if you end up in an emergency succession scenario. The sixth thing that you need is a quick reference guide. This is a quick guide that you can look at that has access to all of the key information that's needed, so that basically executives are going to have a list of things like passwords. They're going to know, who they're talking to in terms of lending. They're going to know key partners for different projects. There's a lot of information that, particularly in small and medium-sized businesses, that executives keep in their head, or they have in some kind of proprietary note-keeping spreadsheet that they keep. If a new executive walks into that role, even temporarily, and they don't even know how to log into the computer, they don't know how to access any of the programs, you are stuck. And you're going to spend the next 3 months just trying to figure out how do you get into things. And so what you want to have is a quick reference guide. Some of this, if you already have record-keeping policies in place, some of this will be covered and already be managed in that. But overall, you want to have a guide that whoever's stepping into this executive role can quickly access and find out who are the key people I need to contact, what are the key account numbers, what are the key access codes, all of those kinds of things. It's all written in one place. It's obviously a sensitive document and a secure document, but you do need to have this, and it'll make life so much easier if you do. If you don't, I cannot tell you how many organizations have spent longer than a year trying to reconstitute this from scraps and pieces of information, and the burden that places on the leader who needed to step onto that role is ridiculous. So there's no reason to not have this in place. It will always be valuable. Don't put yourself in the spot of wishing you had it. The seventh thing that you need is completion criteria. This is something that not everybody, actually almost nobody thinks about. And I know of some scenarios that actually created massive conflict in an organization because people didn't think about when is the acting successor role, interim successor role over. What indicates that the old CEO or whatever their title is now back in the saddle, so to speak? Because sometimes they may be back in the saddle, but they're still remote, or maybe they're still part-time. The transition may not be very obvious, and particularly in a long-term scenario, if they've been gone for a long time, the acting or interim successor may have really started to build things around them and their personality, depending on the authorizations they've been given. And so there's lots of different ways that it can be confusing about the hand back period. And so you want to define when is the emergency succession time frame done. At what point do we say, okay, we now have our permanent leader in place, whether it's the old one coming back or a new leader, and we're moving forward under this structure. Emergency succession planning is what keeps your business moving when leadership changes unexpectedly. But it's only the first piece of a holistic plan. In my next video, I'll cover staff succession planning, or what I call strategic staffing. This is a blueprint for how to build a leadership bench and prepare your team for the future that you want to have. After that, check out the video on planned executive succession. That's the kind of succession process that most leaders think of when they hear about succession planning. But it's often the last of the succession plans that you need to build. You can start with the staff succession planning right here.